Ethan Brooks would remember that morning for the rest of his life because he truly believed that walking through those revolving glass doors with his baby in his arms would cost him everything. At 6:30 on a gray Tuesday morning, the streets outside Grand Regent Hotel were already filling with commuters clutching coffee cups and rushing toward another workday, while Ethan sat motionless inside his aging sedan, gripping the steering wheel with trembling fingers. In the back seat, 8-month-old Noah slept peacefully inside his car seat, completely unaware that the next few hours might determine whether they would still have a place to call home. Ethan glanced at his phone again, hoping for a miracle that refused to come. The babysitter had canceled less than an hour earlier after her own emergency. Every daycare nearby was already full, and every person he trusted enough to call had either been working overnight or living hundreds of miles away. Missing today's shift wasn't an option. Grand Regent Hotel was hosting one of its largest corporate conferences of the year, and every restaurant employee had been scheduled weeks in advance. One absence without notice could easily end a probationary employee's career, especially for someone like Ethan, who had spent nearly a year proving that being an Omega never made him less capable than anyone else. He quietly turned around and smiled at Noah through the rearview mirror. The little boy opened sleepy blue eyes before stretching tiny fingers toward his father, smiling with complete trust. Ethan forced himself to smile back, even though anxiety tightened his chest. "I'm so sorry, buddy," he whispered. "I promise I'm going to figure this out." He stepped outside into the cool morning air, adjusted Noah's diaper bag over one shoulder, lifted his son into his arms, and stared at the towering hotel entrance. The polished marble, gleaming brass doors, and elegant flags fluttering above the entrance suddenly felt far more intimidating than they ever had before. Every instinct told him to turn around, drive away, and somehow invent another solution, but there wasn't one. Rent was due in 4 days. Noah needed formula, diapers, and medicine after catching a mild cold over the weekend. Ethan's checking account held barely enough money to cover groceries for the rest of the week. Losing this job wasn't simply an inconvenience. It meant losing the fragile stability he had spent months building after Noah's other parent quietly disappeared before the baby was born. Taking one deep breath, Ethan walked inside. Warm golden lights reflected across polished marble floors while hotel guests rolled expensive luggage through the lobby. The scent of fresh coffee drifted from the restaurant, accompanied by the familiar sounds of silverware, quiet conversations, and breakfast orders already beginning to flood the kitchen. Ethan lowered his head, hoping to avoid unnecessary attention as he hurried toward the employee entrance. Every passing second felt borrowed. Every smiling guest felt like another witness who might unknowingly watch his career collapse. He had one simple plan. He would settle Noah inside the small employee break room, check on him whenever possible between serving tables, and somehow survive until his shift ended. It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only one he had. As the employee hallway came into view, Ethan finally allowed himself the smallest breath of hope. Maybe, just maybe, if luck stayed on his side for a few hours, nobody would ever know his son had been inside the hotel at all. Every carefully planned minute began slipping away the moment Ethan Brooks settled Noah inside the small employee break room. The space was barely larger than a storage closet, furnished with a worn couch, a coffee machine that hummed constantly, and a locker wall that had seen years of long shifts. Ethan spread Noah's favorite blanket across the couch, placed several toys within reach, prepared a bottle, and whispered softly, "Daddy will come back every chance he gets." Noah answered with a cheerful laugh that briefly melted away the fear weighing on Ethan's heart. For a moment, it almost felt possible that everything would work out. The breakfast rush quickly erased that illusion. Within minutes, the restaurant filled with executives attending the conference, business travelers checking out, and families beginning their vacations. Every table seemed occupied. Every server moved at twice the normal pace. Coffee orders, breakfast specials, and room service requests flowed non-stop through the kitchen. Ethan focused on every guest with his usual professionalism, greeting each customer with genuine warmth while silently counting the minutes until he could check on Noah again. Every 10 or 15 minutes, he found an excuse to pass near the break room, each time relieved to hear only quiet babbling or gentle cooing behind a closed door. His coworkers noticed his unusual behavior almost immediately. "Sarah, Another server who had worked beside Ethan for months quietly asked if everything was all right. Ethan forced a reassuring smile and simply answered that he was dealing with a family emergency that he hoped would only last the day. She wanted to ask more questions, but another table needed attention before the conversation could continue. As the morning grew busier, Ethan's opportunities to check on Noah became fewer and farther apart. He glanced repeatedly toward the hallway while balancing trays of orange juice, pancakes, omelets, and fresh fruit. Every second away from his son felt longer than the last. Then, just before 9 o'clock, the hotel entered another level of controlled chaos. A convoy of luxury vehicles arrived outside the main entrance carrying board members, investors, and the hotel's executive leadership. Managers immediately straightened their uniforms. Supervisors hurried through the lobby with clipboards in hand. Every employee understood exactly what this visit meant. Ryan Foster, the hotel's chief executive officer, had arrived to personally welcome the conference delegation before attending a series of executive meetings. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The timing could not have been worse. He lowered his head, hoping to remain invisible among dozens of employees serving breakfast. At almost the same moment, Noah woke from his nap. At first came a tiny whimper that Ethan barely heard over the clatter of dishes. Then another. Then silence. Ethan silently prayed that his son would settle himself again. Instead, Noah released a loud, frightened cry that echoed down the quiet employee hallway before spilling into the restaurant entrance. Several servers froze. 2 cooks looked toward the hallway. Sarah's eyes widened with confusion. A nearby supervisor frowned immediately. The crying continued, louder this time, innocent yet impossible to ignore. Ethan's face lost all color. He placed a tray onto the nearest service station without saying a word and hurried toward the hallway. But before he could reach the break room, the restaurant manager stepped directly into his path. The older man's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief as another unmistakable cry echoed through the corridor. Conversations around the dining room slowed. Curious guests turned their heads. Employees exchanged nervous glances. The manager looked at Ethan, then toward the break room door, and quietly asked the one question Ethan had dreaded hearing since sunrise. "Ethan, is there a baby inside this hotel?" Ethan Brooks felt every pair of eyes settle on him before he found the courage to answer. His throat tightened, but lying was no longer possible. Noah cried again from behind the break room door, and the sound echoed through the employee hallway with heartbreaking innocence. Ethan lowered his head and quietly replied, "Yes, sir. He is my son." For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The restaurant manager stared at him in disbelief while nearby employees slowly gathered, pretending to organize trays or polish glasses even though every ounce of their attention remained fixed on the unfolding scene. Sarah looked from Ethan to the closed break room, finally understanding the worried expression he had carried all morning. Instead of judgment, her face reflected concern, but she knew there was nothing she could say that would change what was about to happen. The manager released a slow breath before speaking in a measured voice. "You know this violates hotel policy." Ethan nodded immediately. "Yes, sir. I know." "Then why would you do something this reckless on the busiest conference day of the month?" Ethan swallowed hard. He explained that his babysitter had canceled unexpectedly before dawn. Everyday care had been unavailable, and missing work would almost certainly cost him the job anyway. His voice never rose above a respectful tone. He did not ask for sympathy. He simply explained the impossible choice he had faced that morning. The manager listened without interrupting, but his expression remained unreadable. "Bring your son," he finally said. "The executive office will decide what happens next." Ethan's heart sank. He had expected this moment from the instant he stepped through the hotel's front entrance. Yet hearing the words spoken aloud somehow made everything feel painfully real. He entered the break room, lifted Noah into his arms, and gently wiped away the little boy's tears. Noah smiled the moment he saw his father, completely unaware of the storm surrounding them. Ethan kissed the top of his son's head before walking back into the hallway. Conversations throughout the restaurant faded as employees quietly watched him pass. Some offered sympathetic glances. Others simply looked away, unable to witness the scene without feeling uncomfortable. One supervisor whispered to another that probationary employees had been dismissed for far less. Another employee quietly murmured that nobody had ever brought a baby into Grand Regent Hotel before. Rumors spread faster than breakfast orders. By the time Ethan reached the grand lobby, staff members from housekeeping, concierge services, valet operations, and guest relations had already heard fragments of the story. Some believed he had hidden the baby intentionally. Others assumed he had ignored company policy without thinking. Very few understood the desperation that had led him there. The polished marble floors suddenly felt impossibly long beneath Ethan's feet. Every step echoed louder than the last while Noah rested peacefully against his shoulder, gently holding one of Ethan's fingers. The innocence of that tiny hand made Ethan's chest ache. He silently promised himself that no matter what happened next, he would never allow Noah to believe he had been a burden. They stopped outside an executive conference room where several senior leaders waited. Through the partially opened doors, Ethan caught a glimpse of expensive suits, neatly arranged folders, and executives discussing conference schedules. Then another quiet movement drew everyone's attention. Ryan Foster entered the lobby from the main entrance after greeting several international guests. Calm, composed, and carrying the quiet confidence that naturally filled the room, the chief executive officer walked toward the conference area while exchanging brief greetings with department heads. The restaurant manager straightened immediately before stepping forward to intercept him. Ethan could not hear every word, but he clearly saw the manager gesture toward him and Noah. Ryan's eyes slowly shifted across the lobby until they rested on the exhausted Omega holding his baby. In that single silent moment, Ethan became certain his career had just reached its final chapter. The lobby grew so quiet that Ethan Brooks could hear Noah's soft breathing against his shoulder. Ryan Foster stopped several feet away and looked first at the frightened baby, then at the exhausted young waiter whose uniform was still perfectly pressed despite the impossible morning he had endured. No one dared to speak. Department managers stood frozen beside marble columns. Guests slowed their conversations, and employees watched from a respectful distance, convinced they were about to witness the end of Ethan's career. The restaurant manager cleared his throat and began explaining the situation in a formal tone. He described the violation of company policy, the hidden child in the employee break room, and the disruption that had spread through the restaurant during the busiest breakfast service of the month. Ethan kept his eyes lowered throughout the explanation. He knew every word was true. When the manager finished, another heavy silence settled across the lobby. Ryan did not immediately respond. Instead, he studied Ethan's face with calm attention, noticing the dark circles beneath his eyes, the quiet determination that had not disappeared despite the fear, and the protective way he held Noah close without realizing it. Then Ryan asked a simple question. "How old is your son?" Ethan blinked in surprise before quietly answering. 8 months old, sir." Ryan nodded once. "What is his name?" "Noah." The chief executive officer looked directly at the little boy. Noah had stopped crying several moments earlier, but the unfamiliar crowd made him cling tightly to his father's shirt. Ryan took one slow step closer. Several executives exchanged confused glances. The restaurant manager appeared ready to continue discussing policy, but Ryan gently raised one hand, signaling for patience. He lowered himself slightly until he was almost at Noah's eye level and smiled with genuine warmth. "Hello, Noah." The baby stared at him with wide blue eyes, uncertain but curious. Ethan instinctively tightened his embrace, afraid that every passing second only delayed the inevitable decision. Then Ryan did something nobody expected. Without raising his voice or making a dramatic announcement, he simply extended both hands toward Noah in a quiet, unspoken question. Ethan hesitated. His heart pounded so loudly that he barely heard anything else around him. He had never imagined the chief executive officer of one of the country's most respected luxury hotels asking to hold his son. Unsure of what else to do, Ethan carefully transferred Noah into Ryan's waiting arms. The movement lasted only a few seconds, yet it seemed to stretch into eternity for everyone watching. Ryan supported the baby with practiced confidence, adjusting Noah comfortably against his shoulder. For one brief moment, Noah looked around as though deciding whether this unfamiliar person could be trusted. Then the little boy reached up, wrapped one tiny hand around Ryan's tie, and broke into a bright smile. Soft laughter escaped him as if the fear from moments before had completely disappeared. A quiet gasp spread through the lobby. Even the executives standing nearest the conference room looked stunned. The restaurant manager's expression shifted from certainty to complete disbelief. Sarah, watching from the restaurant entrance, covered her mouth with one hand while tears gathered in her eyes. Ryan smiled back at Noah naturally, gently rocking him with small movements that immediately soothed the child. There was no performance, no attempt to impress anyone, only an unexpected moment of kindness that transformed the atmosphere inside the hotel. Ethan stood speechless. His hands, suddenly empty, trembled slightly at his sides as he watched the most powerful person in the building calmly comforting the little boy he had been so desperately trying to protect. And for the very first time that morning, Ethan realized that perhaps the next words Ryan Foster spoke would not be the words everyone had been expecting. Ryan Foster continued gently rocking Noah while the silence around them slowly gave way to quiet curiosity. The baby rested comfortably against his shoulder as though he had known him for far longer than a few seconds, occasionally reaching for the polished silver name badge pinned to Ryan's tailored navy suit. A faint smile crossed Ryan's face before he finally looked back at Ethan. "Come with me," he said calmly. "Bring the diaper bag." The word surprised everyone. No one had expected a private conversation. Most had assumed security would already be escorting Ethan out of the building. Instead, Ryan led him toward a smaller executive meeting room beside the main conference hall. The restaurant manager followed several steps behind, carrying an expression that mixed confusion with concern, while two senior executives quietly exchanged uncertain glances before remaining outside. Once the door closed, the atmosphere changed completely. The polished conference table, floor-to-ceiling windows, and peaceful city skyline created an unexpected sense of calm after the tension of the lobby. Ryan carefully sat down without disturbing Noah, who had begun playing with the edge of his tie. He looked at Ethan and spoke with the same steady tone he had used from the beginning. "Tell me what happened this morning. Start from the beginning." Ethan hesitated. For the first time that day, someone had asked without sounding angry or impatient. He took a slow breath and explained everything. He described the early morning phone call from the babysitter, the desperate search for another caregiver, the unanswered calls, the full daycare centers, and the impossible decision between abandoning his shift or bringing Noah with him. He admitted that he knew he had violated hotel policy, but believed losing his job for trying would be better than abandoning his responsibilities as a father. His voice remained steady until he quietly added, "I have never missed a shift, sir. I just did not know what else to do." Ryan listened without interrupting once. When Ethan finished speaking, the room remained quiet for several moments. Ryan glanced down at Noah, who had fallen asleep again with remarkable trust, his tiny hand still resting against Ryan's jacket. "Where is Noah's other parent?" Ryan asked gently. Ethan lowered his eyes. "He left before Noah was born. It has just been the two of us ever since." There was no bitterness in his voice, only acceptance born from many months of carrying every responsibility alone. He explained how he worked extra shifts whenever possible, skipped unnecessary expenses, and spent every evening caring for Noah himself because every dollar mattered. He never asked anyone for special treatment. He simply wanted the opportunity to keep earning an honest living. Ryan slowly nodded while absorbing every word. His attention shifted briefly toward the restaurant manager, standing quietly near the door. "How has Ethan performed since joining Grand Regent?" The manager answered immediately. "Excellent attendance. Strong guest reviews. Reliable during high occupancy periods. No disciplinary record before today." Ryan asked another question. "Have we ever had complaints about his professionalism?" "None," the manager admitted. Ryan looked back toward Ethan, noticing how exhausted the young Omega appeared despite standing with remarkable dignity. This was not someone searching for excuses. This was someone who had exhausted every option before making an impossible choice. Ryan's expression grew thoughtful as he glanced once more at the peacefully sleeping child. Then he quietly asked a question that caught everyone in the room completely off guard. "If the situation were exactly the same tomorrow morning, would you make the same decision again?" Ethan answered without hesitation. "Yes, sir. Because my son depends on me, and I would rather face consequences myself than ever let him believe I chose my job over him." Ryan held Ethan's gaze for several silent seconds, and something in the room shifted once again, because for the first time that morning, the conversation was no longer about a broken policy. It had become a conversation about what kind of people the hotel truly wanted to stand behind. Ryan Foster remained silent for several more moments before carefully placing the sleeping Noah back into Ethan's arms. The little boy barely stirred, resting comfortably against his father's shoulder as though he could finally sense that the danger had begun to pass. Ryan stood and walked slowly toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. The conference schedule waiting on the table no longer seemed like the most important responsibility of the morning. Without turning around, he asked one final question. How many other employees do you think have faced impossible situations but were too afraid to tell anyone? Neither Ethan nor the restaurant manager answered immediately. The silence itself became the answer. Ryan finally turned back toward them with a calm expression that carried quiet certainty. Policies exist to protect standards, he said. They should never prevent people from doing the right thing. The restaurant manager shifted uneasily, unsure where the conversation was heading. Ryan walked back to the conference table and opened the folder containing the day's executive agenda. Instead of reviewing conference notes, he picked up a pen and wrote several brief reminders on the first page. He then looked directly at the manager. Effective immediately, Ethan Brooks will not be disciplined for today's decision. The manager blinked in surprise. Sir, if the staff believes exceptions can be made, they may begin ignoring other policies. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. There is a difference between ignoring responsibility and carrying too much of it alone. His words settled over the room with quiet authority. He did not bring his son here because he was careless. He brought him because every responsible option had already failed. Ethan stood speechless, hardly believing what he had just heard. Ryan continued, I expect every policy to be followed whenever possible. I also expect every leader in this hotel to recognize the difference between misconduct and desperation. The restaurant manager slowly nodded. Understood, sir. Ryan was not finished. He pressed the intercom on the conference table and asked his executive assistant to postpone the next meeting by 30 minutes while department directors gathered in the executive boardroom. Within minutes, several senior leaders entered, expecting another discussion about conference logistics. Instead, Ryan addressed them with remarkable clarity. He spoke about leadership, trust, and the responsibility every organization carries toward the people who dedicate their lives to serving others. Without revealing unnecessary details about Ethan's personal life, he explained that real leadership required judgment, compassion, and the courage to see individuals instead of simply enforcing rules. He announced the creation of an employee emergency support review, allowing managers to respond to genuine family crises with practical solutions rather than automatic punishment. Human Resources would immediately begin developing emergency childcare partnerships with licensed providers near the hotel, along with a confidential process for employees experiencing unexpected family emergencies. The executives exchanged surprised looks before gradually nodding in agreement. Several admitted they had never considered how quickly a hard-working employee's life could unravel because of one unpredictable morning. Ryan ended the meeting with a simple statement that no one in the room would forget. If we expect our employees to treat every guest with humanity, then our leadership must demonstrate that same humanity first. As department heads quietly left to begin implementing the new initiative, word spread through Grand Regent Hotel faster than any rumor from earlier that morning. Employees who had expected to witness a dismissal instead learned that the chief executive officer had transformed a frightening mistake into an opportunity for meaningful change. Sarah found Ethan standing quietly outside the conference room, still holding Noah close, and smiled with visible relief. Ethan looked down at his sleeping son before lifting his eyes toward the executive office once more. For the first time since sunrise, the weight pressing against his chest had begun to lift, but deep inside, he sensed that Ryan Foster's decision was only the beginning of a journey that would change far more than one difficult day. Ethan Brooks returned to work the following morning expecting curious glances and whispered conversations, but what greeted him instead was something he had almost forgotten how to recognize. It was respect. Sarah smiled the moment she saw him walk through the employee entrance and handed him a fresh cup of coffee before the breakfast rush began. A cook who had barely spoken to him before offered a quiet welcome back, while several servers simply nodded with genuine warmth. The rumors had spread throughout the hotel, but they no longer focused on the policy Ethan had broken. Instead, Employees spoke about the conversation that had changed the direction of the company. Many quietly admitted they had experienced their own moments of desperation over the years and wished someone had listened the way Ryan Foster had listened. Ethan appreciated every kind gesture, yet he remained determined not to let sympathy define him. He wanted to earn every bit of respect through his work, just as he always had. During the weeks that followed, Grand Regent Hotel remained busier than ever. Conferences filled the banquet halls, weddings occupied the weekends, and tourists packed the restaurant from sunrise until late evening. Ethan threw himself into every shift with renewed purpose. He remembered regular guests by name, anticipated special requests before they were spoken, and never hesitated to help teammates even after finishing his own responsibilities. Guests began mentioning him repeatedly in online reviews, praising not only his efficiency, but also the calm kindness that made every meal feel personal. Department supervisors started requesting Ethan whenever important clients reserved private dining experiences because they trusted his professionalism under pressure. One afternoon, an elderly guest accidentally left an envelope containing several $1,000s intended for a charitable donation. Ethan discovered it while clearing the table after lunch. Without opening it or asking questions, he immediately delivered it to hotel security. The grateful guest later returned in tears after realizing the envelope had been safely recovered. Word of Ethan's honesty reached every department within hours. Ryan Foster quietly learned about the incident during his afternoon operations briefing. He did not interrupt the meeting or make a public announcement. Instead, he simply asked one question. Was anyone surprised that Ethan was the one who returned it? Around the conference table, every manager answered the same way. No. Ryan smiled faintly because trust built through consistent actions was more valuable than any single heroic moment. As months passed, Ethan gradually became the person new employees naturally sought for advice. He patiently trained inexperienced servers, encouraged nervous team members before difficult banquet events, and reminded everyone that every guest deserved to feel welcomed regardless of who they were. His leadership never depended on authority. It grew from quiet consistency and genuine compassion. Even on exhausting days, he treated coworkers with the same patience he showed Noah at home. One evening after a particularly successful charity gala, the restaurant manager approached Ethan before the end of his shift. "I owe you an apology," he admitted sincerely. "That morning, I only saw a policy violation. I should have seen a father doing everything he could." Ethan smiled gently and shook his head. "You were doing your job. We all learned something that day." The manager extended his hand, and Ethan accepted it without hesitation. From across the dining room, Ryan happened to witness the exchange while reviewing service standards with another executive. He said nothing, but the quiet expression on his face revealed that the culture inside Grand Regent Hotel was changing exactly as he had hoped. Ethan had walked into the building months earlier believing he was fighting only to survive. Now, without ever asking for recognition, he had become the kind of leader who inspired others simply by showing them what quiet integrity looked like every single day. Nearly a year passed, and Grand Regent Hotel no longer resembled the place Ethan Brooks had first entered carrying nothing but fear and hope. The emergency family support program introduced by Ryan Foster had become one of the hotel's proudest initiatives, earning praise from employees and industry leaders alike. Staff turnover dropped noticeably, guest satisfaction continued to climb, and employees often remarked that the hotel felt less like a workplace and more like a community where people genuinely cared about one another. Ethan never took credit for any of those changes. He simply continued arriving early, working with quiet dedication, and returning home each evening to Noah, who had grown into a cheerful toddler whose laughter filled their small apartment with warmth. Every milestone Noah reached reminded Ethan why he had refused to give up on that difficult morning. One Monday afternoon, the restaurant manager asked Ethan to report to the executive conference room before the lunch service. Ethan immediately wondered whether something had gone wrong, even though he could not think of a single reason. As he walked through the familiar hallway, memories of that unforgettable day returned with surprising clarity. This time, however, there was no fear in his steps, only quiet curiosity. When he entered the room, he found Ryan Foster seated beside several department directors and members of the hotel's executive leadership team. Ryan welcomed him with a calm smile and invited him to take a seat. After a brief review of restaurant performance, guest satisfaction reports, and employee development programs, Ryan folded his hands on the conference table and looked directly at Ethan. "Over the past year," he began, "you have demonstrated professionalism, integrity, consistency, and genuine leadership. You have earned the trust of your coworkers, the respect of our guests, and the confidence of every manager in this building." Ethan listened quietly, unsure where the conversation was leading. Ryan continued, "Leadership is not measured by a title. It is measured by the way people grow when they work beside you. We have watched that happen every day." He slid a neatly prepared folder across the table. Inside was an official promotion letter appointing Ethan Brooks as the new restaurant supervisor of Grand Regent Hotel. Ethan stared at the document in complete disbelief. For several long seconds, he could not speak. The promotion represented more than a new position. It meant financial stability, better hours, stronger benefits, and the opportunity to build an even brighter future for Noah. Ethan finally looked up at Ryan, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you," he said softly. "I will do everything I can to deserve this trust." Ryan smiled and answered, "You already have." The announcement was shared with the restaurant staff later that afternoon. Instead of polite applause, the room erupted into genuine celebration. Sarah hugged Ethan first, laughing through happy tears as she reminded him of the frightened father she had seen rushing through the hallway months earlier. The restaurant manager shook Ethan's hand proudly, telling the entire team that no one had earned the promotion more honestly. Even longtime employees who rarely showed emotion stood to congratulate him. That evening, Ethan finished his shift earlier than usual and drove home carrying a small bakery box containing Noah's favorite vanilla cupcakes. After dinner, he sat on the living room floor while Noah toddled excitedly between scattered building blocks. Ethan gently lifted his son into his arms and whispered, "We did it, buddy." Noah smiled with the joyful innocence only a child could possess and wrapped both little arms around his father's neck. At that quiet moment, Ethan realized the greatest reward had never been the promotion itself. It was knowing that his son would grow up seeing that kindness, perseverance, and honest character could open doors that fear alone never could. Across the city, Ryan stood in his office looking out over the evening skyline, satisfied that choosing compassion over judgment on one ordinary morning had created a future far brighter than anyone in that lobby could have imagined. 2 years later, Grand Regent Hotel hosted its annual Employee Appreciation Gala, an evening dedicated to celebrating the people whose commitment had shaped the hotel's reputation. The grand ballroom glowed beneath crystal chandeliers, while soft music filled the air and hundreds of employees gathered with their families to share a night that belonged entirely to them. Ethan Brooks walked into the ballroom wearing a tailored black suit instead of his restaurant uniform, holding the small hand of Noah, who was now a bright and energetic little boy proudly wearing a tiny navy jacket that made him look remarkably grown up. As restaurant supervisor, Ethan had helped organize the evening, but he never imagined he would become part of the program itself. Ryan Foster greeted employees one by one before stepping onto the stage as the applause gradually settled. Behind him, photographs from the past year appeared on the large screen, capturing smiling teams, successful events, community volunteer projects, and moments of everyday kindness that rarely appeared in business reports but defined the heart of the hotel. Ryan thanked every department for their dedication before pausing longer than expected. His eyes moved across the audience until they found Ethan. "There is a story I have wanted to share for a long time," he said. "Not because it is about one employee, but because it reminded me what leadership is supposed to look like." The ballroom became completely silent. Ryan spoke about a difficult morning years earlier when a frightened father believed he had reached the end of his career because life had placed him in an impossible situation. He explained that policies mattered, excellence mattered, and accountability mattered, but none of those principles should ever erase compassion. Without mentioning unnecessary personal details, he described how one unexpected conversation had challenged every assumption he carried about leadership. "That morning," Ryan continued, "I believed I was making a decision about one employee. Looking back now, I realized that employee transformed me instead." Many guests quietly wiped away tears as Ethan listened in complete surprise. Ryan invited Ethan to join him on the stage. The applause grew louder with every step Ethan took until the entire ballroom rose to its feet. Ryan presented him with a Leadership Excellence Award recognizing not only outstanding service, but also the example of integrity, humility, and perseverance he demonstrated every day. Ethan accepted the award with trembling hands before looking out across the room, filled with friends who had become family. He thanked his co-workers for believing in him, his team for growing alongside him, and Ryan for choosing understanding over judgment when it would have been easier to do the opposite. Then he looked toward Noah, who stood near the front of the stage beside Sarah, smiling from ear to ear. Ryan knelt and gently opened one arm without saying a word. Noah laughed happily and ran across the stage before wrapping both little arms around Ryan in a warm embrace that felt completely natural. The ballroom answered with another wave of heartfelt applause, but Ryan simply smiled and hugged the little boy back with the same quiet kindness he had shown years before. Ethan watched the moment with grateful eyes, remembering the terrified father who had once stood in the lobby believing his future was over. Instead, that single act of compassion had created lasting friendships, stronger leadership, a healthier workplace, and a brighter childhood for his son. As the evening came to a close and families gathered for one final photograph beneath the sparkling lights, Ethan realized that success was never measured only by promotions or awards. It was measured by the lives made better because one person chose empathy when everyone else expected judgment. And somewhere in the middle of that joyful celebration, the story that had begun with fear quietly became a legacy of hope that would be remembered inside Grand Regent Hotel for many years to come.